And it's interesting, Liam, isn't it, in all of this, that this is a bit of a case of optics not working or timings not working more than anything else.
I think that's exactly right, Stephen. I'm here in Birmingham with GB News colleagues. Last week's Labour conference was dominated by economics and financial markets, and this week's Conservative Party conference, the first, of course, for Liz Truss as Prime Minister, is likely to be the same. You're right about the optics. Look, if you cut the top rate of income tax from 45p in the pound to 40p in the pound, it's hardly going to cost the Treasury any money at all, because only around 650,000 people earn that much money. And evidence from the past shows that if you cut top rates of tax, you actually get more money for the Treasury. So this isn't about actual finance. It is about politics, as you say. A lot of people, including a lot of people here in Birmingham, a lot of people on the Tory backbenches, as well as the Labour Party, of course, thought to cut the top rate of tax when there's a cost of living squeeze, people are worried about making ends meet. That looked politically tin-eared. It looked as if the government was remote and out of touch. And that's why ultimately the Chancellor and the Prime Minister have decided to reverse this, to do a pretty big U-turn. Because the reality is, this may not have got through the House of Commons. And Liz Truss couldn't have afforded a Commons defeat on flagship economic and financial policy so early in her premiership.
Raises the question, Liam, doesn't it, as to how weak this now makes the Chancellor look ahead of his big speech this afternoon.
It does. They are between a rock and a hard place. The media was saying, you have to listen, and now they have listened. The media's screaming, U-turn, U-turn. You know, nobody ever said that politics was easy. I think for GB News viewers and listeners, for everyone listening and watching at home, what this means is that interest rates now are likely to rise by less than we previously thought. The money markets are pricing in an interest rate increase to around 5.5% by the middle of next year, from 2.25% now, so there's still a big amount of increase to go. The Bank of England interest rates are at 2.25%, but it's not as big a rise as we previously expected. You know, I don't think financial markets are particularly worried about the amount of money the top rate of tax reduction would or would not have cost. What they're worried about is political and financial uncertainty about yet another change of government, another political mess, which would have looked bad for the UK and would have disrupted economic policy making. The reality is that they could not have got this through the House of Commons, so they've reversed on it. That means there's less likely to be political turmoil in the next few months. What we have now here in Birmingham and across the Conservative government is a blame game. Liz Truss has said that this top rate of tax cut was Kwasi Kwarteng's idea. The Treasury is now briefing that a young Chief Secretary to the Treasury actually wrote a paper advocating this notion of lowering the top rate of tax just before this mini-budget. We may never know who actually came up with this policy, but we certainly know it is no more.
And for a lot of people, they may not even really care whose fault it was. What they'll want to know is, will the lenders and the banks be sorting them out with the mortgage, which they were on track for last week and then got derailed? And lots of people very, very worried about that.
They are very worried, Isabel, and they're right to be worried. What's going on here is a big global long-term increase in interest rates. We've been in a world of ultra-low interest rates since the global financial crisis back in 2008-9. Those ultra-low interest rates were introduced in order to stop the global banking system blowing up. But then financial markets, they quite liked them. Politicians quite liked the low interest rates because it meant they could borrow and spend more money and try to be popular. But of course, a lot of us locked ourselves into mortgages at those low interest rates, thinking that they were never going to rise. But in the end, what goes down must come up again, and we are in a global situation where interest rates across the world are going up. In the money markets, where mortgage lenders actually raise money that they then lend on to prospective and existing homeowners. The interest rate is currently about 4.1%. It's gone down a little bit this morning because of that statement by the Chancellor. So what we're looking at going forward is interest rates on mortgages of 5.5% going up to 6%. That's quite low by historic standards, but for many young people who've bought homes in recent years, that's higher than they've ever known. And the danger is that there is distress in the housing market because of these rising interest rates.
In a very odd position, Liam, doesn't it, in the fact that, you know, if you read the papers or listen to various Labour politicians particularly, of course, they say this is all the government's fault, everything's the government's fault. As you said, a lot of this is down to the global markets. It begs the question then, how does the government try and bring things under control on a domestic front when there is a global issue?
That's completely right. Look, every currency in the world is going down against the dollar. The Federal Reserve, the US Central Bank, is raising rates very, very aggressively. There's a lot of geopolitical angst, not least because of the war in Ukraine. Lots of money goes to the dollar in those circumstances. The pound goes down, the Japanese yen goes down. You've got emergency moves by central banks in many other countries, not just the UK. And actually, you know, the UK isn't looking bad in principle, because our debt is relatively low, our national debt, what the government owes, compared to other big G7 countries. Our inflation is now below the Eurozone average, even though it's still quite high. We're not in recession, we learnt last week. The growth figure's actually better than many suspected. But it's all about presentation, as you say. The government's got to explain that this is a global phenomenon. It's got to explain why interest rates are going up. It's got to explain why inflation is still high, not least because of the COVID-era lockdown. That's a lot of the reason we've still got lots of inflation, because global supply chains aren't yet properly reconfigurated. The world economy hasn't rebooted. There's not enough supply because of the hangover from the disruption from COVID. Of course, it's very hard for politicians to admit to all those things, but they need to do it. They need to get ahead of this argument. They need to explain to the general public why this is happening if the general public is going to, in any sense, forgive them.